Good. You never looked back, as you shouldn't. You were able to divorce her without even speaking to her. You know how many people, even people who have written in, oh, I kept contact with her. Oh, she kept texting me. She kept calling me. Ah, you completely did away with her and moved on with your life and divorced her. That's how you have to do it.
Hugo is the man. Hey, True. A friend recently shared your channel with me and said I needed to share my story. It is a long one, so I advise anyone listening to get the popcorn ready. This happened many years ago in the early 1990s. Yes, pre cell phones days, and is the story of my divorce. Back when I was 23, I met my soon to be wife, 21, at a Midwest university where I was employed. I will never forget the first time I saw her. She had the most amazing smile, and her blonde hair and blue eyes had me completely mesmerized. I will call her Sue. Sue was the most amazing person to have ever entered my life, and we instantly feel deeply in love. The thing that I recall the most about her was her strong religious values, so much like mine, and how we could talk to each other for hours and never get bored. We dated for 3 amazing years before getting engaged and then married a year later. Everything was going great, but the only real downside to our relationship was that she was a nurse who worked 12-hour night shifts at one of the large medical centers in our Midwest city. This wasn't a huge problem for me, but she always came home from work around 7:45 a.m. all stressed out and wanting a few glasses of wine to unwind from her long shifts. As much as I wanted to, I couldn't partake in breakfast drinking before heading out to work, and this always seemed to disappoint her. During our second year of marriage, I noticed something was a little off, and I couldn't figure out what it was. She would tell me she was working some extra overtime and would come home much later than her normal 7:45 a.m. arrival time. On one occasion, I decided to surprise her and spontaneously took a day off work so I could party with my sweetie when she got home. There is nothing better than her walking in that door, wearing those sexy scrubs and smiling that killer smile. A heart stopper for sure. I knew she was off the next few days and would be up for some day drinking. Well, as you probably guessed it, she didn't arrive home until well after 12 noon, stumbling into the house smelling of alcohol, something totally uncharacteristic of her. She acted super surprised to see me, and I could tell she was trying to think of an excuse to tell me as she was looking at the floor and not in my eyes like she usually does. I asked her what was up, and she shared that several of her colleagues found a bar not far from the hospital that opened at 7 a.m., which was the perfect place for them to unwind and relax before going home to sleep. Sue was a terrible liar, and I was shocked that she said what she did, as I knew for a fact that no bar in our town could legally be open to serve alcohol. Before 10 a.m., she immediately jumped into the shower and kept saying how sorry she was for not coming home at her normal time. I have a strong intuition and immediately suspected that something was going on. The thing that gets me most upset, even to this day, is how almost every day she and I would pray to strengthen our marriage, and how she would talk down about cheaters in a way that made me swear she would never cheat on me. She would even walk out of a movie if the main character cheated on their spouse, as she said this made her physically ill. So, I really didn't suspect she was cheating on me, but her lying about going to a bar that morning made my stomach feel as if I got suckered punched. I didn't want to have a big fight over this issue, so I just moved on and decided to hold off on making any kind of accusation without having any physical proof. As luck would have it, my brother had called me earlier in the week to tell me that one of his good friends, a guy named Hugo, had recently moved to my city from our hometown back east. I had set up a time to grab a few beers with Hugo later that afternoon, while I knew Sue would be sleeping. I came to find out that Hugo was a real character, and we both gelled immediately. I confided in Hugo about my situation, and together we came up with a plan to determine if indeed Sue was cheating on me. Hugo was studying to be an actor and said this would be a great time to impersonate a private investigator. I carried several great pics of Sue and told him all the information I could about her employer and her schedule. Hugo was super confident that if anything was going on, he would find out about it. I went to the ATM and gave him $500 as I didn't want him to do this for free. We parted ways and decided to meet up the following week. Hugo would call me, telling me he was getting close and he needed more time. This went on for several weeks. As the weeks passed by, Sue was extra affectionate and couldn't keep her hands off me. Intimacy had never been better. The next few weeks were as normal as could be, and I got mad at myself for giving Hugo $500 so he could tell me nothing was going on with Sue. When the time came to finally meet up with Hugo, I was feeling confident he was going to tell me that he couldn't find anything out. As soon as he sat down, I knew it wasn't good. He told me that he used his acting skills to pretend he was visiting his grandmother in the hospital and always made time to flirt with the receptionist at the unit Sue worked on. He said he even introduced himself to Sue and most of the other nurses on the floor as the nights went by. Eventually, the receptionist agreed to go out on a date with Hugo, and he got her a little tipsy. He asked her about some of her colleagues and then brought up Sue intentionally and asked her if Sue was in a relationship. She told him that she was marred, but she had seen her being super affectionate with one of the doctors. I will call him Dr. D. She also said that one of the nursing assistants walked in on Sue and Dr. D hugging in a hallway, which was unusual given that it was weird for an attending physician to come up to the floor in the middle of the night. So, ladies and gentlemen, Hugo did not disappoint. Not only did he provide me with Dr. D's home address and phone number, but he also found out that he rented a studio near the hospital. So he didn't have to commute home to the suburbs to be with his wife and 5 kids, who were all under the age of 12 at the time. Prior to my meeting with Hugo, Sue said something to me that made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. She had shared with me that several of her colleagues had planned on grabbing a few glasses of wine at their new favorite bar the following Thursday morning after work. I still can't believe she used that pathetic bar excuse. Plus, it was funny that this bar she always talked about didn't have a name other than that bar. For an additional $500, Hugo agreed to follow her that morning and ended up with amazing evidence that she and Dr. D were indeed having an affair. He had taken some great pictures of them entering his apartment hand in hand, and had several shots of the two of them passionately kissing as she was leaving his place with him in his boxers 60 minutes later. One of the pics showed him kissing her with his hands down the back of her scrubs, clearly groping her backside. I called Sue later that day to tell her that I needed to work late and wouldn't be home at my normal time. I skipped out of work the rest of the afternoon and was able to set up an appointment with a lawyer who came highly recommended. This guy was super professional, so I went with him. He said he would do everything he could to draft up the legal papers to start the divorce process immediately. And since we didn't have any children and both made equal salaries, that this would be an exceptionally easy divorce. I met up with Hugo that night and just got super depressed and drank way more than I should have. The more I drank, the angrier I got. I couldn't believe Sue was cheating on me. That was the hardest thing to comprehend. I wanted to not only surprise Sue with divorce papers, but I also wanted Dr. D to suffer as well. I knew that the best surprise would be for Mrs. D and I to surprise them while they were together. Not knowing Mrs. D was the biggest unknown, as I feared she wouldn't want any part in what I was planning. After thinking about it long and hard and hearing from Sue, that their Thursday morning drinking plans might become a weekly thing, I just bit the bullet and made the call. She originally didn't answer, but I left a message with their nanny who promised me that Mrs. D, her first name was Judy, would call me back as soon as she got home. 20 minutes later, I got the call. I remember feeling like I wanted to vomit when the phone rang. I just came straight out and told her everything that I knew and told her about all the pictures I had, etc. She was quiet for a long time and then jumped on a soapbox about how this wasn't the first time he had cheated on her and how he promised it would never happen again. It was obvious she wanted to go after him for all he was worth. I told her that the two of them planned another romp the following Thursday morning, and she said she was all in on whatever it was I was planning. After consulting with our lawyers, we basically both came up with what I recall at the time as simply being a petition to divorce. So it wasn't actual formal divorce papers, but the first form submitted in our state when one spouse decides to apply for a divorce. We both had the forms filled out in a few days and made certain that we attached the very damning photos to the forms. What was going to happen next? Well, Hugo was the man and gets 100% credit for coming up with our next move. Now, before describing the next move, I need to share with you another side story. Sue and I had gone out to dinner right before she started her Wednesday night shift. I was having second thoughts about Hugo's plan and decided to give her a way out. As we were eating, I had shared with her that Mike from my office had recently discovered his wife was having an affair. Sue immediately grabbed my hand and said a prayer to watch over Mike and to help his wife find the repentance for her actions. After she was done praying, I told her how I had encouraged Mike to get a divorce and that he was starting the process. Sue shook her head and said divorce is not the answer. If his wife seeks forgiveness, then Mike needs to forgive her, and together they can make it work out. I laughed out loud at her comment and told her directly in her eyes that if the same thing was to happen to us, that I would divorce, no question about it. Sue looked down at the table and quickly changed the subject before heading off to work. The next morning was what you all call D-Day. Judy, Hugo, and I all met up at a corner restaurant near the hospital to put his plan into action. I thought for certain that my dinner conversation would change Sue's mind, but unfortunately, at exactly 7:20 a.m., Sue walked out of the hospital parking garage and started heading down the street towards Dr. D apartment. Hugo ran ahead of us and made certain that she did indeed go into his apartment. 10 minutes later, Judy and I arrived on the sidewalk outside his apartment. We both kind of stood back behind a row of bushes as not to be seen from the apartment. I recall shaking like crazy and feeling like I was in a different reality. Hugo was decked out in full-on construction gear with yellow vest, hard hat, thick safety glasses, a fake mustache, and carrying a clipboard. He detonated 2 very smelly stink bombs and then started pounding on their door. Dr. D yelled from behind the door, asking what was going on, and Hugo, in his best acting performance to date, yelled that he was with the gas company and there was a major leak and that everyone needed to exit the apartment immediately as it could explode. I recall being probably 20 yards away and the smell was almost unbearable. About 20 seconds went by before the door opened, and the two of them came running out only to be greeted by Judy and I holding our divorce papers. Like the coward he was, Dr. D immediately ran back into his apartment and locked the door, leaving Judy to pound on it repeatedly while tearing into him like a woman possessed. Sue was on her knees with her head in her hands, bawling. I stood over her and asked her to look up at me. She never would. After one very loud command from me to look up, she did. I told her to take this envelope and read it very carefully, as my lawyer would be in touch. I also told her that the only way she could speak to me in the future would be through my lawyer, whose card was stapled onto the envelope. She started pleading with me and saying that it wasn't what it appeared to be and not to do this. Now, this is the one thing in retrospect I wish I hadn't done, as I'm not proud of this at all. I worked up the biggest spitball I could and just spat straight in her face, telling her thanks for ruining my life. After that, I walked away, calling after Judy to leave his envelope outside his door and deal with him later. She ran over to me as Hugo pulled the car up, and we both got in and drove off. I still to this day have permanently imprinted the image of Sue on her knees crying while hugging the papers and swaying back and forth outside Dr. D's smelly closed door. This was the last time I saw her. When I got back to my place, I made 3 very important phone calls informing my parents, Sue's parents, and our local minister what had just happened and how they would all be receiving a packet in the mail outlining the reason I was filing for divorce. Yes, the photos were on their way. I also called my boss and quit my job effective immediately. My bags were packed and I left never to return. 6 months later, we were officially divorced, and I was able to do it all without ever speaking to her. She really hurt me, guys, and this experience forever changed me. I eventually landed on my feet and never looked back. I never got remarried, but did find the love of my life while on holiday in the Florida Keys a few years later. And yes, she wears sexy scrubs just for me. Life is good, my friends. Sincerely, Just Jim. P.S. Hugo never became a famous actor, but he did end up marrying one. They live in L.A., and he is now a successful insurance agent. I also heard from Judy that she successfully divorced Dr. D and took him to the cleaners. I understand she remarried a few years later and is doing well. And as for Sue and Dr. D, I have no idea whatever happened to either of them, or I hope I never do.